one thing I want to leave is my legacy as the mayor of Seattle, is that we are one Seattle. See, in a one Seattle, we invite dialogue and learning, collaboration, thoughtful exchange.
Well, that's Mayor Bruce Harrell right there talking about One Seattle. So, how are some of his aspirational goals there going to match up with a major policy decision on the eviction moratorium, which is set to expire this week in Seattle? How is the city council going to deal with a tactic used by the Seattle Police Department to misinform and mislead demonstrators during the 2020 protests? And what's cooking in the short session for the state legislature starting this week? A lot to cover here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are my own. I am joined by the one and only David Croman of the Seattle Times. David, you are the transportation reporter for the Times, but I think you were the snow and flood reporter for the Times over the past week or so. What's been going on? Have you been able to dry out yet?
Well, I mean, it was, we had a ton of snow and then a ton of rain really quickly because the temperatures jumped really quick. And that combination makes for really gnarly conditions, especially in the passes. It makes for great avalanche conditions. And then also especially for the poor people in the Chehalis River Basin near Centralia, which is, very prone to flooding. And they saw some of the worst flooding they've seen in more than a decade. So, yeah, that's kind of what we've been paying attention to over the last few days.
Yeah. A lot going on there. Well, thanks for breaking all that down, David. We're going to talk about some of that snow and flood activity, what's happening with the state legislature when it comes to transportation this session later on in the show. A big thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. They're on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks to owners John and Riley. Please do support them, other small businesses too. Thanks also to the patrons of the show. Bradley just jumped on board to support the program. Thank you, sir. We're hoping to get more people to come in at the $10 level to join our mug club. I have one here. David, I'm sending yours out via Pony Express. I'm sorry, it'll get to you soon, but I did want to show our mug shot of the week. It's coming from Kevin. He sends in a lovely photo of a hardworking mug right there. Thank you very much for that, Kevin. Thank you to all of our patrons out there. Support independent journalism, would you? At Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Finally, thanks to Converge Media, the video version of our podcast runs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, here we go with right here, right now. Okay, so not a ton on the city council's agenda this week, the full council's agenda for that matter. There's some discussion about extending that free permit for businesses to use sidewalk space, restaurants, etc. as we recover from the COVID pandemic. We'll keep track of that on the calendar, but the committees are where the action is this week. And one issue in particular hits the Public Safety Committee, once again, headed up by Councilmember Lisa Herbold. That committee is talking about a ruse used by Seattle police during the CHOP protest of 2020, where officers were using their radios to try to fake out demonstrators. They said 20 to 30 armed members of the Proud Boys, the right-wing extremist group, were heading up onto Capitol Hill. That likely led some protesters to arm themselves, and the council was very concerned about this. Committee Chair Lisa Herbold has asked the Office of Police Accountability to brief her committee on this issue. The head of the OPA, Andrew Meyerberg, will be doing that. It appears the two officers who supervised this ruse have since left the department, and no discipline has been advised for the 4 officers who followed along. All right, so that's all the backstory here. David, in looking at this, state law allows officers to use ruses like this when they're undercover to deal with threats to life or public safety here, but they're not supposed to push disinformation that lacks fundamental fairness, as the law states there. What's your take on this investigation by the OPA and really what it means for the Seattle Police Department?
Yeah, I mean, honesty and or dishonesty is it's a big, in sort of the world of policing, and this has changed recently, but historically, one of the very few things that you could actually lose your certification as a police officer for doing is lying. I mean, there's a lot of things that officers do and then can keep their certifications, except lying was always the kind of line that that the systems that certify officers, drew their line at lying and dishonesty. And so when you see ruses being used like this, it sort of creates this impression that there might be a double standard, which is that if it's sort of department sanction lying, then they can get away with it. And so, like you said, ruses are not totally illegal. There are some circumstances where officers are allowed to use ruses, namely kind of undercover operations.
Right.
But this is the second time the Seattle Police Department has gotten a lot of criticism
Hmm.
for a ruse. In
Right.
2019,
Hmm.
some officers were investigating. I think it was a
It
drunk
was a hit
driving
and run. Yeah.
hit and
Hmm.
run.
Yeah.
Um, and basically told this person who had maybe been involved with this crash that they had killed somebody, and
Hmm.
that it was way more serious than it actually was, when that wasn't actually the case. And then that
Right.
person eventually went on to kill themselves. And
Yeah.
it's difficult to connect things directly, why
Sure.
somebody might
Sure.
take their own life, but
Yeah.
the fact that this happened, it obviously raised questions. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that this feels like an issue that is going to build momentum over
Yeah.
the coming months, and I would uh, expect that there could be some changes.
I think so too. And it's interesting you bring up that 2019 case about the hit and run, which the OPA said they actually made a link between that case and that person killing themselves, which is an awful thing. An officer was disciplined for 6 days, suspended there. But at the time, the OPA was talking about, okay, we need to improve our training when it comes to this type of thing of using ruses or whatever else. I think Councilmember Herbold wants to take it a step further here and saying, officers, if they use ruses like this, these have to be documented here and they have to be investigated because this is an important part of training. I look at this, though, David, because the mayor has weighed in too on this. He's saying, let's change the culture of the SPD. He's been talking about that a lot on the campaign trail, I know, over the past couple months here. But how do you change a deep set cultural issue like this? I know there are a lot of them in the police department, but this seems like very deep set when it comes to disinforming the public. How do you change that within a police culture?
I mean, yeah, this question of how do you change a police culture is kind of bedeviled the city of Seattle for the last, I don't know, probably longer than this, but at least
And
since
other
2010.
departments too. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Keep going.
Right. But you can see that you can make policy changes, and you can sort of draw more parameters around accountability and uses of force. But this question of culture is much more nebulous. Like, how do you create a sort of different culture? I don't know that anybody has a great answer for that. So, you'd mentioned with the ruses, I think one thing that is really challenging about them, or has been, and I think this is what Councilmember Herbold was getting at, which is, um, there was not any sort of written documentation of this being carried out.
Hmm.
I have seen some criticism on social media of the local press for not writing about this earlier, because it is a 2020 event.
Yeah.
And I accept that and understand that. At the same time, if you read the OPA investigation, none of this
Hmm.
was written down anywhere. There wasn't
Right.
any sort of like
Hmm.
documentation that this is what we're going to do. This was just like people coming up with an idea. And the only reason OPA got to it is because
Right.
in the interviews, the officers and the supervisors that they interviewed,
Hmm.
said, yeah, we did this. They
Right.
admitted to
Right.
doing this.
Right. Right.
And so just the fact that, there wasn't really any sort of single document that any reporter or anyone, or, city council person could request and read
Hmm.
over and
Yes.
figure out that they're doing this.
Hmm.
Like, really the only reason we know that this ruse happened is because some activists got suspicious that this was
Yep.
actually truthful, and their hunch turned out to be correct.
Right.
Um,
Right. Right. I
so,
know.
I think
Yeah.
documentation and transparency, I think, is probably going to be a big focus.
It's a key part of this. And I have to, well, we'll see what happens going forward from this. But I know the mayor, in terms of looking forward and selecting a chief of police or whatever else, he's talking about a lot of culture change. And we're going to have to see how that pans out. But I did want to talk about another big decision for the mayor that is coming up right here this week. We're talking about the eviction moratorium that is set to expire on January 15th. Will he or won't he extend that? It's a press conference happening on Wednesday from the mayor on this. So watch out for that. I'm also covering the issue on this week's City Inside Out on Seattle channel. So, David, the decision from the mayor here to extend an eviction moratorium I should say, in Seattle a seventh time is very important. But I think really underscoring that is this larger issue of landlords and tenants not getting the government aid that they're asking for and they've been waiting for. I know the Seattle Times reported on this. King County, in charge of distributing these funds, the county has not even processed applications from about 10,000 renters because county officials don't know if they're going to have enough funds to help out. So I'm looking at this, and my point with this, I don't know if another eviction moratorium is really going to solve the larger problem here. Some thoughts about this?
Yeah, I don't know what he'll do. I think throughout the pandemic, folks have kind of acknowledged that an eviction moratorium was never going to solve the
It's
problem.
not an
I think a
answer,
lot
right?
of
Hmm.
uh, it is a stopgap measure to sort of prevent more catastrophic impacts, because there is a direct link between evictions and homelessness, and that is not something that anybody wants to see.
Hmm.
At the same time, I think the eviction moratorium, and how long it's gone on, is sort of indicative of how I think a lot of the policies to address the financial hardship of the pandemic were created under the assumption that this pandemic would not go on for 2 years.
Hmm.
Um, and so now what we are left with is, like you said, some of the relief for renters and landlords is starting to run out. It's unclear if there's enough.
Yeah.
And yet the pandemic, we're hitting more cases every single day
Yeah. Right.
than we ever have during the pandemic. And
Hmm.
we're not in lockdowns like we were before, but of course this is still
Right.
having a financial impact on people. And so,
Hmm.
um, it's not there's not a great decision one way or the other. It's just if it's a question of like, do you think that this is going to turn a corner at some? Does the mayor think
Right.
that another couple months of an eviction moratorium is really going to do the trick, or is this
Right.
just going to keep going on and on? I don't know how he is going to view this. It does
Yeah.
seem like it would be a difficult time literally right now to end the eviction moratorium,
Hmm.
because cases being what they are. And
Hmm.
before she left office, Mayor Jenny Durkin sort of surprisingly vetoed a measure from the Seattle City Council rolling back hazard pay for grocery
Right.
store workers.
Hmm.
And I think that caught people by surprise, but it was an acknowledgement that even the pandemic of today is not really even the same pandemic as 2 months ago. I
Right.
think if this was 2 months ago, I would say absolutely he's going to end the eviction moratorium. But
Hmm.
Omicron being what it is, I really don't know. I mean, I think it's it's not a kind of rock in a hard place right now.
No, no, and it's a really interesting case study. I see it, David, as kind of a test of this one Seattle concept. We're going to talk about this more later on in the show, but this whole idea of one Seattle that the mayor was talking about, we heard about it in the start of our show here too. He had a lot of big property owners, as you know, supporting his campaign. That was definitely a piece of it. And landlords certainly aren't big fans of this continued moratorium, but got a lot of renters in Seattle who are saying, we need more time, we need more help. It's just one of these issues, David, of I'm not quite sure of how the mayor is going to deliver this message. When you talk about all the renters who are in Seattle, we're a majority renter community. More people rent than own in our area here. When you talk about the landlords that are here too, how does he deliver that message here? That's my big concern with this too.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do think I have seen, as you mentioned, people raising the fact that he had a lot of real estate developers and landlord groups donating to his campaign. I don't
Hmm.
know if that will factor into his decision or not. Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm sort of unsure of what he's going to do is we haven't seen Bruce Harrell as mayor very much. I mean,
Hmm.
he hasn't sort of campaigns are fine and good, but we haven't actually seen him really make a big decision yet. And this is his first, and so we just don't really know what kind of mayor Bruce Harrell is going to be yet. And I do think that this eviction moratorium decision will give us a hint.
Definitely, definitely so here. All right, well, a lot still ahead on that. We'll continue to follow what's going on with that story there. And we're going to touch more on that one Seattle concept in just a little bit, as I mentioned. But up next, a short session in Olympia, already one, though, that's seeing impacts from the continuing COVID pandemic. We're going to talk about it coming up on Now Hear This. Well, welcome to the start of the state legislative session in Olympia, everybody. A short 60-day session where lawmakers work on a supplemental budget, also prepare for an election later this year, a number of those lawmakers there. But it's going to be another session where lawmakers, at least to start, will not be meeting in person to vote. 3 senators so far in COVID quarantine. You got testimony from the public. That's going to have to be online too. But as Representative Kirsten Harris Talley from the 37th District in Southeast Seattle and Renton told me last week, don't let that stop you from getting involved and having your voice heard.
It's not a session to sleep on. We're still going to be having big conversations and talking about big solutions for our neighbors. And please, please give testimony, reach out to your representative. All my neighbors here in the 37th, thank you for your thoughts and all of the meetings during interim. I look forward to more so that we get this right in this session.
David, I'm looking at a few things the legislature needs to pay attention to in this short session. One of them, putting a delay on the long-term care insurance bill. That definitely needs some changes. They're also tweaking some of the police accountability measures that they voted through last year. More than a dozen bills pushed through there. Tell me about what you're keeping an eye on this session.
Well, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I am keeping my eye on transportation.
Of
What
course,
they're
yeah,
doing with
it's what
transportation.
you do. Yes.
Um, that Yeah, it is now what I do. Which is, last session, we saw some really big proposals from lawmakers, Democratic lawmakers mostly,
Mhm.
in between 17 and 25 billion dollars to overhaul the state's transportation system, and that was built around a gas tax. And that,
Mm.
if those had gone through, that would have brought the gas taxes in Washington State up to almost $1 a gallon. That
Mhm.
didn't happen, and now, interesting enough, is Democratic lawmakers are suddenly not interested in proposing a gas tax,
Hmm.
at least most of them. And I think that's for a few reasons. I mean, one, the state has more money than it was expecting to at this
Right.
point.
Mhm.
Um, there is, in theory, some money coming in from a new carbon pricing plan, and then there's federal money. And so that kind of changes the dynamic around how lawmakers might fund transportation. But
Hmm.
also, as you mentioned, it's an election year, and nobody
Yeah,
really, Democrats are worried about what could be a rough 2022 for them. And
sure.
they don't want to be seen raising your gas taxes at a time when gas prices are already really high. So that's something I'm looking for, is how much money can they cobble together for transportation without raising significant new taxes.
Right, and you talk about the surplus dollars that are out there. I know some of the state Republicans have said, "Hey, this surplus we have, we're at a 20-year high right now. If anybody's talking about new taxes, that's slightly ridiculous." I wonder about that piece too. You mentioned the election year here. I just wonder how much pushback. Granted, Republicans are in the minority in all three pieces here. The governor's a Democrat. You have Democratic majorities in the House and in the Senate at the state level here. But I just wonder how much that dialogue about where we're getting our money from and the amount of money that's there is going to dominate this session. I guess realizing too that a lot of those dollars are one-time funds from the feds for COVID recovery. There's a lot to balance there, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's an interesting time that we just had this conversation about eviction moratoriums, and people are
Right.
still struggling out there, and yet
Yeah.
the legislature is actually has kind of a lot of money to work with,
Hmm.
which creates an interesting dynamic. So, um, yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a politically charged session
Yeah.
because of, Republicans have already shown a willingness to kind of whack Democrats over the head with some previous pieces of legislation. As you mentioned, the long-term
Yeah.
care act and the police reform legislation, that some of the rollout on both of those has been a little bumpy.
Yeah.
So I think and I think Republicans genuinely think they have a pretty good shot at making significant gains in 2022 in the
Hmm.
election, and they're going to be really aggressive, I think, in the session to try and either push back on Democratic ideas, or where they can't push back, sort of frame them as the lefty Democrat one
Oh
party
yeah.
rule kind of gone crazy, that sort of thing. So it's going to be a tense and politically charged session. Um, and at the same time, I think Democrats are feeling like, if they want to get some of their big priorities done, this might be the session to try and do it. And just in case they
Hmm.
lose control of, say, the Senate.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it'll be a high pressure session for sure.
I've definitely felt that too. There was one piece of it, David, that I thought was very interesting. Governor Inslee actually showed up in Ballard last month talking about a new investment into homelessness, $815 million in supplemental funds. And the budget that he's proposed is a pretty big one. Even some of the Democrats have admitted that to me in talking to me about this. He's talking about some serious spending, again, with a lot of these one-time funds we're talking about here. But in looking at this, I'm wondering how this investment in homelessness is going to play out at the state level. He's talking about trying to build more of these mid-level, kind of that missing middle, as it's called, some of that housing there that would help out people that might not be making as much or whatever else. He's talking about building shelters too. I'm very interested to see how that interaction of state dollars being pumped into different resources on a regional level, maybe in King County and definitely other places around the state. I'm interested to see how the state's going to make an impact on homelessness this year. Any thoughts about that piece?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it'll the thing with these sorts of dollars is, especially if you're talking about building housing,
Yeah.
it'll take a little while for
Hmm.
people, real people on the ground to kind of see those dollars come to fruition. So I'm, local elected officials will take any, especially in King County and Seattle, will take any dollar that they can get from the state to help out on this project. I mean, this problem, and they've been asking the state for major investments every year since at least 2015, and the federal government as well. So, I mean. Who we'll see what kind of impact it has. I think it's probably too soon to say if it's going to be enough of an impact that in your kind of day-to-day life as you're walking down the street, you will notice that difference.
Right. We're talking about some long-term investments here, but definitely, as you say, something that our regional partners are looking at here, especially the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. I know they're looking for every chance they can to really establish themselves as a new agency this year. All right, we'll keep an eye on that. But I did want to, if I could, David, go through one last observation with you here. Mayor Harrell talking about One Seattle. I brought this up earlier in the show. I thought it was very interesting to hear him address members of the press in his inaugural remarks. He spoke directly to the press, even brought up the journalist creed of 1914, written by Walter Williams. Only write what you believe to be true in your heart, be tolerant, patient, respectful. David, my fellow journalist, we got to talk about ourselves here, I guess, but your thoughts about this, that part of Harrell's address, that call out to the press, what did you read into that?
Well, first of all, I had never heard of a journalist creed like that before. I didn't know that existed.
There's a plaque of it above the National Press Club, which I've never been to, but Walter Williams, big former dean of the University of Missouri journalist department. So I'm with you on that. I had to look this up too. Keep going.
I mean, Bruce Harrell, I think his relationship with the press, and I experienced this a little bit when he was a city council member. I didn't, when I was covering him when he was on the city council, I probably talked to him less than any other member of the council. And I don't think that would come as a surprise to other journalists. And, I don't want to read too much into what his sort of perceived relationship is with the press, but I do think him reading that in his first press conference is, I think that was a pointed message to the press, which is like, I cover me fairly, like write good stories about me. I think it's as a member of the press, I think it's that's not that, you don't want to receive that message from the mayor. I mean, that's it's a sort of by nature, it doesn't always have to be, but at the end of the day, the press and the mayor are going to have a adversarial relationship with one another to a certain extent. And that's just the way it is. And I think this was a plea from him for that not to be the case, but I don't really think that's his decision to make.
Yeah, again, it's going to be a short honeymoon for him. I know that. All other parts or other phrases from the journalist creed you want to hang on to here, David. Stoutly independent and indignant at justice. It's good stuff. I haven't memorized it all yet, but
he didn't read.
No, he didn't.
And he didn't read those parts of the journalist creed, the stoutly independent, and
He did not. So I'm interested to see that too, but it's going to be, this is a campaign, or excuse me, a mayorship that's just getting started here, as you mentioned earlier, but a big decision ahead with the eviction moratorium, some other big decisions ahead when it comes to police and selecting a police chief and a new head of the Department of Transportation. So there's a few big decisions still ahead here. So we're going to be talking about that over the next several weeks and months here, but we need to move on here. We're talking about closed passes, flooded freeways. David talking about all that and more as we shift into gear with Transportation Talk. Well, David, you have been all over Western Washington over the past week here. Snow closing down just about all of our major passes there. You got floodwaters over I-5. The joys of being a transportation reporter, I guess. I just wanted to talk about what you've seen, what that's telling you about our state's ability to respond to major winter storm activity like this. What's going on?
Yeah, it was a kind of an eye-opening thing, I think, for a lot of people that 1 week of really bad weather can basically cut off the Puget Sound region. I mean, for at least a day there, you couldn't get out of Seattle you couldn't head east and you couldn't head south because all the mountain passes were closed to the east, and I-5 to the south was closed due to flooding. So I think I think really what this says more than anything in some ways is the climate is going to change. who knows if these specific incidents were related to climate change or not. You know, you could get into that, but the climate is changing. We're having much wetter winters,
Yeah,
which is something that people, I think forecasters expect will continue to be the case.
sure.
Not to mention hotter summers, which can
Yeah,
do damage to roads as well.
yep.
And so, you know, I think people talk a lot about resiliency in the system. Basically,
Yes.
the system you've created, how well can it stand to changes and like this? And I would say that over the last week, our system was clearly not all that resilient. One really bad and heavy precipitation front comes through, and
Hmm.
suddenly freight is stuck on the east side of the mountains,
Right.
and hospitals, you know, first responders can't go up and down I-5, and
Sure.
it caused some serious problems for people. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think we will. It is a sign of how we're going to continue to have these conversations about resiliency in our system for probably the rest of our lives.
Yeah. And the timing of it is just interesting, if I can choose that adjective there, because I know the head of the state DOT was saying, no, even though we had a number of, not a number, but some folks leave WashDOT because of concerns over getting a vaccine, et cetera, whatever else. They didn't have as many employees or whatever else. The state DOT director said that was not a factor in terms of the response, but I know a lot of people have been asking that question too. Any thoughts on that one, David? Just the staffing that the DOT is able to put up here.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, staffing is an issue in every industry right now.
Of course, yes.
Mostly, almost entirely not because of the vaccine mandates, just for a
Right.
lot of other reasons.
Hmm.
But you know, really, the problem over the last week was that the conditions were just really dangerous. So
Yeah.
it was absolutely perfect conditions to create avalanches. You get a ton of snow,
Yep.
and then it warms up. So you get this nice slick on top of all the snow, and
Hmm.
then it cools
Hmm.
down again and snows again. So you've got basically two layers of snow sitting on top of each other, which is
Right.
not what you want. And it
No.
creates. So they had, I think they counted 38 natural avalanches west of Snoqualmie Pass, and something like 200 east of Stevens Pass. So
Wow.
the reason that the passes remained closed for so long was because the crews couldn't go there without fear of getting buried in an avalanche.
Right.
And then by the time they finally could get there, you know, on Stevens Pass, they said they had at some points 35 feet of snow built up.
Right.
So
Right.
no matter how many, you know, staffing might be a challenge for WashDOT. I'm not saying it's not, but when you're dealing with deadly avalanches and 35 feet of snow, no matter what, that's going to
Well,
shut down the passes for a while.
no, a historic amount of precipitation
Yeah.
all over the place there too. Anything long term in terms of I-5 and that Chehalis, Lewis County area there? That I know this has been an issue before. I went down there and covered it. Gosh, seems like more than a decade ago when they actually shut down the freeway there. But that happened again, and I didn't know if there's any lessons learned from a decade ago or what's been happening over the past couple of weeks here to give any insight to how to keep that road open.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, that the Chehalis area, that's not. It's in a lot of that area is developed in floodplains, and people know
Yes.
that, so their
Yeah.
homes are in floodplains
That's
and
right.
expect that. But so there has been conversation a long time about, you know, a quote water retention facility, which is
Sure.
basically just sort of a dam that you only put into use when there's floods,
Hmm. Hmm.
to sort of catch some of that water. But
Yeah.
that's still years away from construction, and it's pretty expensive. So we'll see if
Hmm.
that goes anywhere.
Wow.
But there's also a lot of interesting conversations around what kind of development is allowed where, and logging.
Mm,
You know, if you put a bunch of concrete in a floodplain, then
that's right.
suddenly the water doesn't have anywhere to go.
That's right.
We don't know for sure that had a direct relationship to the flooding we saw over the last week, but it has been
Sure.
a piece of conversation that my colleagues at the Seattle Times have covered over the years, and
Right.
I would expect would continue to cover.
Yeah. Yeah. We got a lot still ahead on that. All right. Well, we need to wrap up the show. And David, I just wanted to ask about something you're looking forward to in the week ahead. We've been talking about surging Omicron cases. We got another atmospheric river, a fire hose of rain pointed at Seattle yet again this week. What are you looking forward to? Some thoughts out there.
Well, as maybe we talked about before, maybe we didn't.
Hmm.
I'm an avid gardener,
Oh, here we go.
and
Okay.
yeah, and January is the time you start getting your seeds in order to start seeds for the next season. So
Okay.
that, that's what I'm looking forward to.
Okay. Getting those in the ground. Anything in particular you are planting?
Yeah, just about everything. We've got a pretty good sized garden. So fire up our grow lights and
There we go.
turn on our space heaters and start growing our kale or whatever.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Well, we're going to have to
Yeah.
start the gardening segment here, David. I can't wait for that. Thank you very much, as always, for your insights here. Thanks also to our patrons. Thanks to everybody listening out there at Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you might listen. Again, please do support the show on Patreon. Always appreciated there. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We will see you soon.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.